Athens in the Golden Age. This is the period that people like to talk about. There is a sort of big picture in this course. I am skimming over it, a half an inch or an inch deep into most of these things that I cover. You could easily run an entire course just on about anything I mention in this section today. So an entire semester. So if you look and see, if you look through 4 years, for example, you look at UNT's actual course offerings. Look through their history, theater, English courses, upper level. You can you'll be able to find easily graduate and upper level courses on all this stuff. So in no way, shape, or form am I about to cover all this completely. And we mean this period. Right, so about 50 years. So all of this build up, and this was in world history, this is just one of the big periods of ideas, human creation, advancement, and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so Athens, a little bit of a bully at the time, claims the crown of victory. It wasn't just the Athenians. A bunch of the other city-states helped them defeat the Persians, or at least keep the Persians from coming in and claiming this area as they had much of the world. Persia being the dominant empire at the time, not what we're talking about here. And it sets off this golden age, is we're going to call. So, but Athens, they're while people love the Athenians, it's a little rich on their part that they do things like they steal all the money. Right, so they pulled the money on when it looks really bad and that we're going to have maintain protection. We're all in this together and stuff like that. And then when the threat subsides, they take the money on the island that they were storing it on, and they use it for their own devices. But then they build things that are still standing today. Okay, so the Athenians got to where they kicked out the tyrants, right? So the individual rulers, and they exercised political power directly. So a direct democracy, unlike our representative democracy, where we elect people to go to the House of Representatives on the national level and in the Senate and so on. Okay, so we don't mean all people of Athens. We mainly mean here the landed, meaning that they own land, usually these olive trees that I was talking about. So on fragmented land that they themselves could defend at times with their house, meaning that all the people who worked for them or were slaves and stuff like that. They would come to Athens and they would vote on major things. And they voted with pebbles. White pebbles, black pebbles, yay, nay. All right? And so they would listen to people talk about things, and they would line up with their appropriate pebble, and they would drop it in a big pot, and then they would turn over the pot after everybody was done, with sort of a big, slender, tall pot, and they would just count them up. Right? And that's what they decided to do instead of having one person rule. All right, so that's what we're talking about. So by the way, if you go to Athens, some of you I find out have been to Athens, and so when you go see that spot, right, historically that's where they voted. All of this big stuff in history happened there. Pericles, right? So this is this is where it all kicks off. Right, in the Golden Age stuff anyway, but I want to talk about his chief consort here, Aspasia. Right? And it's just remarkable at the time. I alluded to this before, but Pericles, I guess he decided he could sort of do what he wanted to in his role, even though he could get ostracized, which was a thing for them. Right? They would vote people off this was the original voting people off the island, or at least out of Athens at the time. If they thought somebody was getting too powerful, they had an ostracon vote, and they would write the name on it, and so that was the same sort of vote, except not with white and black pebbles this time. If whoever was the most popular name would get kicked out of Athens if they thought the person was gaining too much power. But Pericles held on for a long time, and he included his. People had all sorts of disparaging names for her at the time, but his woman friend essentially, and it was really troubling to the Greeks because the Greeks were not in a society especially friendly to women at the time. They thought you want to think a lot more like protecting the homestead or whatever you would like to call it. So if we go back in the day, right, there are no birth tests or blood tests to determine who the father is for sure genetically and all of that. So the Greek men more or less decided that their women should be kept at home. Right? And if they go out in public, you need to have somebody with them, all of this, and they need to secure that bloodline. Right? And so way back before the Athenians and all this, I liken this sort of thing to, just property in general. If you don't know who you're handing your stuff down to, as the chief farmer back in the day, and you've secured, you fought for a whole stretch of land, and then you turn into a farmer after that. You get some slaves. You're running a mass sort of. You're running your business essentially. Well, how do you know who to turn it over to? You're going to turn it over to your firstborn son, is what people decided in this area of the world anyway. And it's really bad if your firstborn son looks like the farmer, like a farm or two over, if he looks like that guy. Right? If that guy's got red hair and your son ends up with red hair and you've got black hair and your wife has black hair, that looks really bad. Right? So you're always thinking in the back of your head, my gosh, not just the ego thing, right? It's just like the whole estate now. Like, should I do this? I'm really anxious about it. In other words, right? So this is going to be the background misogyny. Like, so people who technically that word means hates marriage, but it sort of branches out to mean hates women in general. I don't know about hating women necessarily, but they're very controlling, or they were very controlling. The Greek men were. So this is different. Like the Roman men are not going to be anywhere near as bad. They're not by our standards, are not great, but the Roman men are not as bad as the Greek men, the ancient Greek men anyway. And so it was really troubling to the people at the time that Pericles would let her talk with everybody. And it eventually this subsided, but it caused a lot of problems, essentially. Okay, so Pericles really thinking outside the box at the time. So her name, by the way, Aspasia, right? So go do a presentation on her. If you're interested in her, she was probably something like a high-class call girl that he ended up seeing and making his, essentially. And at the time, that high-class call girls were especially well educated because they were supposed to see very important men and be able to talk about a whole lot of different things. They were trained in different languages, dancing, how to play some instruments, and so on. Okay, Pericles says this, Athens is the school of Hellas. So what he means by this is he's referencing an ancient mythological figure, Helen, so not Helen of Troy. There was an older myth than that most of the Greeks took themselves to be descendants of Helen, a guy Helen, who was the son of some gods, right? And so just about all the Greeks in this area referred to themselves as the Hellenes. So later on, when I refer to other sections of the world getting Hellenized or Hellenization is happening here, that means that Greek culture is coming in. So besides some of the ideas that I'm talking about, that means in these communities who didn't otherwise have things like this, they're literally seeing their roads getting tore up. The Greeks are putting much better, in their mind, roads back in place. They're running these water pipes that I've referenced. They're going to have some sort of water. They're going to make a water source in the center of town somewhere, or as close as they can get to it anyway. If that, they're going to build a theater not too long from here. Matter of fact, even I forget who the scholar was that tracked all this stuff down, but some of the words in the New Testament that Jesus uses, scholars think he got some of these words from a theater that was not too far outside of where he was at the time. Right? So this is a much later period than this, but you get the idea. So that was it. The conquering is going to happen later on by Alexander, right? Alexander the Conqueror, one of probably the biggest conqueror in the world through that time period anyway. So he's inheriting this culture. So Alexander himself is he's not from Athens. He's further north in Macedonia, Macedon, but the culture is the same. So they're going to all call themselves Hellenes, right? We call them Greeks, they called themselves Hellenes, is the idea. All right, so just know that for right now. Pericles, in honor of those who died in the first battles, he has a famous funeral speech. And in future class, I may include this. I'm not including this right now. It is worth doing a whole day on. It is a very profound speech. So right now, if you're interested in doing it, I guess we'll look up Pericles' funeral speech. That is a completely legitimate first presentation topic if you would like to do your topic over your first Pericles. Okay, and so we're going to get to the Olympic Games were a big deal back in the day. Greeks would stop what they were doing, even if they were in the middle of war with each other. Some of these polises, on sundown that day, they would go to killing each other, put their weapons down, load up in boats, and go to Olympus to participate in the games. So they're hugely important back in the day. Right now I would like to talk about this Discobolus. And so if you can remember, it wasn't too long ago that we talked about the ancient Egyptian statue. Notice that some of these things are the same, but some of them now are starting to be a little bit different. So we're taking on more realism is what I'm going to point out here. So whereas the face seems, it's getting a little bit more toward a particular face, it's still what we can mostly say here, it's a youthful face, right? Kind of a generic youthful face, but now some of the actual details are getting filled. Look, he's got the individual muscles here, very lean, the veins through here. No veins on that Egyptian guy stepping forward, right? And so, and notice the implied motion. It's like the sculpture itself, you can start to feel the coiled energy that's about to get released through here, right? So we're taking on realism, but we're not quite there. Later on in Greek society, we are going to be, but right at this point, we're not, is what I'm pointing out for right now. And I was referencing the olive oil and wine from before. These are a big thing with museums because there are so many Greek vases. So every museum has a Greek vase somewhere. Why were they popular? Well, it was all the olive oil and wine that they were transporting. This was the final touch that slaves, mostly on the same couple of streets, were making for not just for the shipping, but for the local keeping and all that. Remember how important having pots were back in the day for storing things. And sometimes the slaves, they all knew each other, but they were very proud in their work and sometimes would taunt each other on their basis. So they found vases where the guy will write below, this is supreme work and so could never touch it. And that guy is likely right across the street or next door or something like that, and knows that he is going to have written that on it. So then he'll try to outdo him and so on. Okay, Greek drama. A lot of the we're going to talk about the Greek playwrights here in just a second, but I want to point out now that even much older than the whole shebang I was just talking about with the Minoans and all that, before they collapsed, even so way, way back, and goes into obscurity, Greek theater grew out of a complex of rituals associated with the worship of Dionysus, right? The god of wine, vegetation, and seasonal regeneration. So it sounds like there was sort of a big festival, right? Where everybody got drunk and did all sorts of, I don't know about a big frat party because it seemed like most of the community was involved, but with all what we would call in the Judeo-Christian system, all sorts of heinous behavior happened in the day. Scholars don't even like to talk about it. They'll just sort of reference it. But part along the way in that festival, people started putting on something like what we would call plays that started with one person and then they grew from there. And that's essentially where plays, playwrights, all that sort of stuff comes from. And these are not easy to build. These are the first theaters. Remember, there is no amplification, sound amplification, there's no power, and yet they did all sorts of profound things here. So you see, one of the things they did, just a basic thing, they start with a hill, carve it out, and they set all this rock. All right, so this is much like if you go to the Meyerson Symphony or Bass Hall. Just take a minute, if you can get there early before everyone else sits down, and look how the natural acoustics work. Right? You got to have, so because they value not necessarily being amped up all the time in these two buildings. So when that happens, the whole building has to change. It becomes much more expensive with modern building technology. But notice here that in the empty places, right, the sound will at least bounce around. Now, on the stage at the time, the actual Greek performers would be in masks. They would have not full-on like cheerleader megaphones, but little megaphones inside the mask to help them project their voices. The mask would have a painted face on, so they're using their arms a lot of times to try to show their emotional states and so on. They got so elaborate at one point that they had like a little crane thing back here. So if they ended up trucking in a god down the line, so a system of pulleys and so on, they would sort of wheel or rope this guy up and haul him over. This was a structure at the time. Set him down here, and so that you can imagine, for people in an audience not used to all the high-tech stuff that you're used to, how miraculous this would all seem and look, and it would sort of delight them and make the whole festival. And so they scheduled this into their calendar, right, their theater festival, and people just loved it, right? And you say, well, why is this a big deal? Well, so think in their context, right? So you all now, you're constantly looking at your screens, and before the screen time came along, people obsessed with television a little bit too much, and before that, radio, and before that, people were just reading a lot at the end of the day, and before they were, well, eventually you go back to here and you just have stuff like this, right? So huge, popular. Okay, Aeschylus, Aeschylus, say this either way. The British people tend to say Aeschylus here. Sophocles, Euripides, some of the big three of the Greek tragedians. The word tragedy itself, so we tend to use the word in its ordinary sense. So there's supposed to be a larger connotation with this. We try to, like, everything is lost. And so I'll say, I don't know that this is too prevalent in Grayson County anymore, but it used to be the case that all high school students had to read Hamlet. Well, at the end of the day, like, Hamlet's not a tragedy necessarily because Hamlet dies. It's because it's the whole order was out of whack to start out with. And not just Hamlet, but everybody's death around there resets the stage. And so in that case, in a different context than we have here, I'm just using this example to give you an idea of the proportion, I guess, is Hamlet was wrong. Like, Hamlet didn't become king. His father was old Hamlet, and his uncle Claudius took over. So that violated God's plan. For the whole, so what happens when you violate God's plan? That's what in the play Hamlet, that's what plays out. But at the end, everybody's got to die, and you've got to have a huge sense of loss because you violated God's plan. Everything's got to just get erased, and then you start over, right? So that's what we mean by tragedy. So at the end of when Sophocles, sort of one of the more dramatic figures. At the time when he puts his eyes out behind stage. You don't actually see him do this on stage. But when he comes back out and is blind because of he realizes how sinful he's been, unknowingly at the time, but he still did it. And so in his mind, he's really contaminated in that he had sex with his own mother and then also made children that are now he's related to in ways that he didn't want to be related to. Right? It's just god awful. Right? So at the end, really, it's not bad in the normal sense of the word. It's bad in a sort of the uber sense of the word. Nothing can be the same at the end of a Greek tragedy. Poetry, Greek poetry. So everybody likes to talk about the the big works, right? Iliad, the Odyssey. There are some larger historical works people don't like to talk about as much. And then the birth of lyric poetry, lyre, meaning the instrument, accompanied by the lyre, Lyre. For whatever reason, seems to have always been a lot more personal. And we are going to lose this in Western civilization for a while after the Romans. Right? So, but the Greeks were much better than the Romans at producing art. And one of the artists, the great lyric writers that we'll go back to, is Sappho, who seemed a very early figure in terms of writing the kind of poetry that we value today. And in today, we're in the post-Romantic period of whatever name you want to call it. And we're going to talk about all this when we get to it. But we tend to, so even if you aren't into poetry, you're at least listening to music and the lyrics associated with the music. Well, that's what they were doing at the time. A lot of this was sung to the lyre at the time. So, and Sappho, by the way, if you haven't heard this before, Sappho liked women. She was on the island of Lesbos, and so that's where the word lesbian comes from. That's the reference. Okay, I think this will do it for this screencast.